Welcome to Secrets in Slumber. Tonight we drift into one of the most enduring and unsettling mysteries whispered across decades, the encounters with the men in black. These are not the visitors who arrive in luminous craft high above the skies. They are the ones who come afterward, after the sighting, after the photograph, after the ordinary has been touched by the extraordinary. They appear at doorways and on lonely roadsides, at kitchen tables and in small-town diners. Always the same: black suits, pale faces, voices steady and eyes that seem to look not at you but through you. As you settle into bed, let the noise of the day fall away. Breathe gently. Feel the quiet of night wrap around you like a soft blanket. This is not a story to alarm, but to soothe. It is a story to accompany your rest, told slowly, evenly, with each word carrying you deeper into calm. The mysteries we explore tonight will not disturb your sleep. They will guide you toward it. Imagine now the hush of late evening, when the world is still. The roads are quiet, the houses dark. A dog barks once in the distance, then falls silent again. In that stillness you notice a sound. The low hum of an idling car just beyond your driveway, the outline of a sedan, its windows tinted, its presence unannounced. Two figures sit inside, waiting. No one called them, no one asked them to come, yet here they are, as if the simple act of seeing something unusual has summoned them. They step from the car in perfect unison, their shoes clicking softly on the pavement. Hats pulled low, suits without a wrinkle, faces pale and expressionless. When they speak, it is without warmth, without hesitation. They ask what you saw. They ask if you told anyone. They ask if you still have the evidence. And when they leave, they take more than objects. They take certainty itself. This is the rhythm of the men in black. They arrive not to explain, but to erase, not to enlighten, but to silence. Across the decades, from the earliest days of the UFO mystery to the modern age of government reports and declassified files, their presence has been felt. Always in the shadows, always just after the moment when truth seems within reach. They are the guardians of secrecy, whether on behalf of human agencies or for something even stranger. No one can say for certain, but their method is unmistakable. They do not shout. They do not shout. They do not strike. Their intimidation lies in their stillness, their certainty, their ability to turn an experience into doubt and a witness into silence. Tonight we will move gently through some of these encounters. Stories of researchers, photographers, farmers, and even military insiders who faced visits that reshaped their lives. We will listen not only to what they saw in the skies, but to what they endured afterward. The knock at the door, the quiet demand for silence, the knowledge that someone or something was watching them closely. As we drift through these stories, remember, you are safe here. You are not in the witness chair, not the one answering the questions. You are simply listening, calmly, as history unfolds like pages in a book. The voices you will hear are from the past. The weight of their silence belongs to another time. All you need to do is let the slow rhythm of the story carry you gently toward rest. Each chapter will unfold like a classified file slowly opened. We will begin with the first whispers of the Men in Black myth, a researcher in the 1950s who claimed he was forced into silence. From there, we will visit a photographer whose evidence was taken, a farmer warned to keep quiet, a motorist threatened after colliding with the unexplainable, and even an Air Force insider who discovered that intimidation reaches into the highest levels of secrecy. We will not hurry. Each detail will be given softly, evenly, as though part of a lullaby woven from mystery, and should you drift into sleep along the way, the story will continue without you. It will be here, steady and unbroken, as the tide of dreams carries you onward. The night is yours now. The questions of the men in black will not trouble you here. They will simply become companions on your journey into rest, shadows that move gently at the edge of memory, mysteries that hum quietly like the distant engine of a car waiting at the roadside. So let your eyes grow heavy, let your breath slow, and as you rest, we will begin. This is the story of the men in black and the silences they leave behind. Chapter 1. The Birth of the Men in Black, Myth. The story begins not in the skies, but in the quiet of a man's study. It is the early 1950s in Bridgeport, Connecticut. The war has ended less than a decade before. The Cold War has begun to stretch its long shadow, and a new kind of curiosity is taking hold across America. The newspapers are filled with talk of flying saucers, strange lights darting across the heavens, discs spotted by pilots and farmers alike. For some, these were only headlines. For others, they became a calling. One of those men was Albert K. Bender. Bender was not a pilot or a scientist, but a clerk, a dreamer, and an organizer. He lived in a modest home, yet inside that home he cultivated an atmosphere all his own. He lined the walls with strange art, symbols from folklore, and writings from ancient cultures. The air, it was said, often carried the faint smell of incense. In this unusual sanctuary, he formed the International Flying Saucer Bureau, one of the very first civilian organizations devoted entirely to the mystery of UFOs. The IFSB was more than a club. It was a network. Through newsletters, correspondence, and printed bulletins, Bender and his associates reached readers in dozens of countries. They collected sightings, shared theories, and created one of the earliest platforms for ordinary citizens to step into the UFO debate. For a brief moment, it seemed like the truth might truly be within reach. But then came the silence. A silence not born of fading interest, but of something heavier. In 1953, Bender abruptly shut down the IFSB. No gradual fading, no slow decline. One issue of the newsletter spoke of expanding projects, of new cases to study, of growing momentum, and then, the very next, it was over. In his final bulletin, Bender wrote in cryptic language that he had discovered the truth behind flying saucers, but that he was unable to reveal it. He urged his readers to continue their interest, but his own voice fell quiet. Why would a man so passionate, so devoted, suddenly withdraw? Years later, Bender would give his answer. He spoke of a visit, one that had shaken him to his core. 3 men, dressed in dark suits, appeared without warning. Their faces were pale, their expressions stern, their presence overwhelming. They did not shout, did not threaten in the way one might expect. Instead, they spoke calmly, deliberately, and conveyed to Bender that his investigations must stop. According to him, they communicated not only with words, but with something deeper, a pressure in his mind that made resistance unthinkable. When they left, they carried nothing physical, but they left behind an emptiness that was heavier than any confiscated file. The IFSB closed, its records were boxed, and Albert Bender, once one of the most enthusiastic pioneers of UFO study, never again spoke freely about what he had discovered. To some, his story was nothing more than eccentric imagination, a fanciful excuse for the collapse of his organization. But to others, it was the first documented pattern of what would later be called the Men in Black, mysterious figures who arrive after a sighting or a surge of interest and leave behind silence. The image of Bender's visitors was striking. Black suits in the early 1950s were not unusual. They were, in many ways, the uniform of businessmen, undertakers, and government men alike. But what witnesses like Bender noticed was not the clothing itself, it was the effect. The air around these men seemed to grow heavier. Their presence carried a strange authority that could not be challenged, and their timing was always precise. They arrived not before curiosity, not long after, but at the very moment when the truth seemed ready to surface. For Bender, the effect was permanent. Though he would later write a book, Flying Saucers and the Three Men, its pages were as much allegory as revelation. He hinted at terrifying knowledge, at truths too great to share, but he gave little in the way of verifiable detail. Readers came away unsettled, convinced that something had happened, but unable to say exactly what. And perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the men in black did not need to seize every photograph or confiscate every note. Perhaps it was enough to cast doubt in the mind of the witness, enough to plant the idea that speaking further could invite consequences. Intimidation, after all, does not require shouting. Often, silence is more powerful. As we sit with the memory of Bender's story, let the details drift through your imagination like faint ripples on a still pond. Picture a man in a modest home, surrounded by clippings and letters, his desk lit by a single lamp. Imagine the knock at the door, the creak of the floorboards as strangers step inside. See their suits, black against the dim glow, their faces unreadable. Hear their voices, calm, deliberate, pressing upon him, not with volume, but with certainty. And then picture the aftermath. The house grows quiet, the newsletters stop. The once lively network falls into silence. Outside, the world continues as before. But for one man, and for those who followed his work, everything has changed. This is how the Men in Black myth was born, not in violence, but in withdrawal. Not in spectacle, but in absence. The silence itself became the story. And so, from Albert Bender's study in Connecticut, a pattern was set. A pattern that would echo across decades and across continents. Witnesses, researchers, photographers, and ordinary citizens would describe the same sequence: an extraordinary sighting, followed by a visit, followed by silence. In time, many would dismiss these tales as folklore, as exaggeration, as the product of overactive imaginations. But others noticed the consistency, the suits, the timing. The way lives were reshaped, not by what was seen in the sky, but by who came afterward. Tonight, we will follow that pattern gently, case by case, each one adding another brushstroke to the portrait of intimidation. We will see how silence was enforced not through force of arms but through the presence of shadows in dark suits. We will hear how the lives of ordinary people were changed forever by the simple fact that someone, or something, arrived when no one else should have known. As the night deepens, let your breathing steady, let the mystery settle lightly on your thoughts. You need not hold every detail, you need only drift with the rhythm of the story. For now, we rest with Albert Bender, the man who first dared to organize the seekers of truth, only to be silenced by visitors he could not resist. This is where the Men in Black myth begins. When Albert Bender fell silent in 1953, it was not only the end of the International Flying Saucer Bureau, it was the beginning of something larger, a ripple that spread outward into the fragile network of researchers, hobbyists, and curious citizens who had begun to study the UFO mystery. In those years, the UFO community was still young. There were no established institutes, no official conferences, no university programs. Instead, there were newsletters printed on typewriters, correspondence exchanged through the post, and occasional meetings in rented halls where a few dozen enthusiasts gathered to share clippings and sketches. The IFSB had been a hub for many of them, a place where the scattered voices of the curious could be collected into something resembling a chorus. When Bender announced its closure, that chorus faltered. The words he left behind were brief, but they carried an unmistakable weight. He had discovered something. He said, something too great to share, something that compelled him to step back. Those who read his final bulletin felt more than disappointment, they felt unease. If Bender had simply grown tired, he would have said so. If the work had overwhelmed him, he would have explained. Instead, his cryptic message seemed almost like a warning. A door had been opened and then slammed shut, but not before a cold draft had passed through. Among his fellow researchers, speculation began immediately. Some suspected that government agencies had pressured him. The early 1950s were, after all, the years of Project Blue Book, the official Air Force investigation into unidentified flying objects. The Cold War was at its height. Secrecy was the norm. If flying saucers were real, then surely they were of military interest, and if Bender had stumbled too close to the truth, perhaps officials had stepped in to silence him. Others believed something stranger had occurred. The way Bender described his visitors did not align neatly with ordinary agents. Their pale faces, their unusual presence, the way they seemed to communicate with more than words. These were not the details one expected from a simple government knock on the door. To those inclined toward the fantastic, it seemed almost as if the visitors themselves were not entirely human. And so the whispers spread. Letters carried the speculation across states and continents. At small gatherings, researchers spoke in hushed voices about the possibility that there was an unseen force monitoring their work. The men in black, as they came to be called, became part of the growing folklore. They were at once government officials and something more mysterious, a shadowy blend of human secrecy and inhuman otherness. For those who continued to write and publish, Bender's fate was a cautionary tale. His sudden withdrawal reminded them that curiosity had its limits. Some grew more careful with their words, couching their theories in more cautious tones. Others doubled down, convinced that the very presence of suppression was proof that something extraordinary was being hidden. And yet, despite the unease, the UFO community did not vanish. In fact, in some ways it grew stronger. Bender's silence became a spark that lit further determination. If someone had been silenced, then surely there was something worth pursuing. The very idea of intimidation fueled more interest, more correspondence, more speculation. Still, the shadow remained. Behind every new sighting report, behind every letter shared, there lingered the possibility that a knock at the door might come. That sense of being watched, of being measured, of being quietly warned, it became part of the atmosphere of the field. Imagine yourself then, as a researcher in the mid-1950s, you sit at a desk late at night, a stack of clippings beside you, your typewriter ready. The lamp glows softly, casting a small circle of light in an otherwise dark room. You write of a sighting in Kansas, a pilot's testimony in Arizona, a farmer's sketch in Ohio. The stories are fascinating, strange, and yet curiously consistent. You prepare to send your bulletin to a dozen subscribers, and then before sealing the envelope, you pause. You remember Albert Bender, you remember how suddenly his voice fell quiet. And you wonder just for a moment, if by putting your words to paper, you are inviting a visit of your own. This quiet hesitation was as much a part of the Men in Black myth as the suits and the sedans. It was not only about who they visited, but about who they never had to visit. The suggestion of their presence alone was enough to instill caution. In the years that followed, stories began to accumulate. Witnesses described strangers arriving after their sightings. Photographers reported negatives disappearing. Researchers noted files shuffled, drawers disturbed. Not all of these accounts could be verified, but each added another brushstroke to the growing portrait. Whether fact, embellishment, or folklore, the pattern was unmistakable. Silence followed sightings, and the Men in Black were the messengers of that silence. For the broader public, these stories remained largely hidden. Newspapers carried reports of lights in the sky, yes, but seldom mentioned the aftermath. The Men in Black did not make headlines. They lived instead in the margins, in letters passed among researchers, in rumors whispered at gatherings, in the uneasy memory of Bender's sudden silence. And yet, slowly, their legend took root. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the phrase Men in Black had become shorthand for a peculiar kind of intimidation, one that blended the familiar with the uncanny, authority with strangeness, silence with fear. As you lie back and listen to these whispers from the past, imagine the feeling of those early researchers. The weight of curiosity pressing against the weight of caution, the desire to know balanced against the fear of being noticed. It was in this tension that the men in black first took shape, not only as figures who appeared in person, but as an idea, a shadow cast across the entire field of UFO study. Albert Bender may have been the first to speak of them openly, but his silence spoke even louder, and through that silence, the myth began to breathe. The 1950s were an age of contrasts. On one hand, the world was recovering from war. Families bought new houses, highways stretched across the land, televisions flickered in living rooms with cheerful broadcasts. On the other hand, the Cold War had cast its long and quiet shadow. Nuclear arsenals grew. Governments tested weapons in deserts and atolls. Fear of the unknown, whether from rival nations or from the skies, was always present. It was in this climate of secrecy and suspicion that the Men in Black legend found fertile ground. Citizens already knew that there were things their governments did not reveal. The phrase "top secret" carried weight. The idea of hidden laboratories, unacknowledged projects and silent agencies was not far-fetched. It was part of everyday reality. Against this backdrop, the sudden silencing of Albert Bender and the whispers of strange visitors fit seamlessly, almost too perfectly, into the atmosphere of the times. The psychology of intimidation is subtle. It does not always require threats or violence. Sometimes, it requires only suggestion. A knock at the door when no one else should know you are home. A question asked in a tone that implies the answer is already known. A look that lingers just long enough to make the ordinary feel unusual. For the witnesses who encountered the Men in Black, it was not always what they said, but how they said it. The men spoke with an air of certainty, as if they had rehearsed the conversation long before arriving. They knew names, dates, and details that had never been published. They did not need to prove authority, because authority seemed to radiate from them. And when they left, the weight of their presence remained. It is worth remembering that the early UFO years were not only about sightings, they were about the growing network of information. Magazines printed reports, amateur groups collected letters, pilots and police officers sometimes filed accounts that made their way into the press. To silence one witness was to halt one story. To intimidate one researcher was to chill an entire circle. Silence, like a ripple on water, spread outward. In the larger world, Project Blue Book was quietly at work. Beginning in 1952, the Air Force cataloged and analyzed thousands of UFO reports. To the public, Blue Book was reassurance. The government was paying attention. To researchers, it was a puzzle. Some reports were dismissed easily. Others carried strange details that were never fully explained. But the presence of an official investigation created an unspoken tension. If the government was studying UFOs, then why did it so often dismiss them as balloons or birds? And if there was nothing to hide, then why did witnesses so often feel the touch of intimidation afterward? In that tension, the Men in Black thrived. They became the embodiment of suspicion, the human face of secrecy. Whether they were real agents or imagined archetypes hardly mattered. They represented the idea that truth, if it was ever glimpsed, would not be allowed to spread. Consider the effect of living in that atmosphere. You see a light in the sky, brighter and faster than any plane. You mention it to a neighbor, who shrugs but listens. Later you read that others saw it too. You decide to write it down, perhaps to share it with a local researcher. Days later, a car you do not recognize idles at the curb outside your home. Two men sit inside. When you step toward them, they drive away slowly. Did they come for you? Were they only passing by? You are left uncertain. That uncertainty grows, and soon you decide not to write the report after all. That is how silence works. It does not always stop the first witness. Sometimes it stops the second, or the third, or the one who might have told the story at the dinner table. Intimidation does not erase the event, it erases the conversation. And so by the late 1950s, the Men in Black had become more than visitors. They were part of the UFO atmosphere itself. Every new sighting carried not only the thrill of the unknown, but the quiet possibility of aftermath. Witnesses no longer wondered only what they had seen in the sky. They wondered if someone might come asking about it. Researchers no longer feared ridicule alone. They feared the quiet knock, the pale face, the suit that never wrinkled. The Cold War reinforced this mindset. Governments were known to keep secrets. Agencies were known to watch citizens. Neighbors were urged to be cautious of one another. In such a world, the idea that mysterious men might enforce silence was not far-fetched. It was in some ways expected. The men in black fit perfectly into the psychological landscape, neither entirely unbelievable nor entirely explainable. As you listen now, let the rhythm of these reflections carry you deeper into calm. The 1950s drift further into the past, and with them, the first roots of the Men in Black legend. Picture the era, black and white televisions humming softly, radios playing news of rockets and satellites, children playing in tidy backyards, and beneath it all, the hum of secrecy. Imagine the men in suits, stepping from black sedans, walking calmly to a door, and speaking in voices that left no room for argument. Whether they were agents of government or something stranger still, the effect was the same. Silence spread. Voices grew cautious, and the UFO mystery slipped further into shadows. This is how the Men in Black became not only visitors in individual lives, but guardians of a greater silence. A silence that lingered in research circles, in living rooms, and in the minds of witnesses who dared to look up. And now, with Albert Bender's story behind us, and the whispers of his silence echoing across the early UFO community, we are ready to follow the next threads of intimidation. From researchers' studies and private newsletters, the Men in Black will move into the lives of individuals whose stories still unsettle us today. Photographers, farmers, and motorists, ordinary people whose brushes with the extraordinary were followed by visits that felt anything but ordinary. The shadows at the door are waiting, and so we turn the page and drift onward. Chapter 2. Silencing the Photographer. The early 1960s brought with them a quiet sense of wonder. Space exploration was no longer just an idea, it was a reality. Rockets thundered skyward, astronauts trained for orbits, and the newspapers carried photographs of satellites crossing the heavens. Humanity was reaching upward, stretching into the cosmos, but beneath the headlines of science and progress, another kind of skyward fascination endured. People were still reporting disks, lights, and objects that moved without wings or sound. Some dismissed them as illusions. Others insisted they were visitors from beyond. For a man in Albuquerque, New Mexico, the mystery was not only something to read about, it was something to capture with his own eyes, and with his camera. His name was Paul Villa Jr. He was a mechanic by trade, a man of ordinary means with an unordinary claim that he had witnessed strange craft in the skies above his desert home. Unlike many who only spoke of such things, Villa reached for his camera. He believed that the truth, if it could be photographed, might stand on its own. In June of 1963, Villa set out to a quiet field on the outskirts of town. The day was bright, the horizon wide, the desert air still. With his camera steady in his hands, he captured a series of images that would soon become some of the clearest UFO photographs of the era. The pictures, when developed, showed structured craft, disks with defined edges, metallic gleams against the New Mexico sky. One photograph revealed a craft tilted at an angle, as though hovering deliberately for the lens. Another showed multiple objects in formation, their outlines sharp and undeniable. To the untrained eye, they looked genuine, uncontrived, startling. For a brief time, Villa's photographs spread among enthusiasts. They were passed from hand to hand, studied, debated. Some saw them as the long-awaited proof that flying saucers were real. Others scoffed, dismissing them as clever fabrications. But the images were too clear, too bold, to be ignored. Then, as so often happens in these stories, the visitors came. Villa spoke later of being approached by men he did not recognize. They were neatly dressed, formal, and precise in their questions. They knew of his photographs before he had shown them widely. They asked where the negatives were stored, whether he had shared copies, and who else might have seen them. Their voices carried no anger, only authority, and their eyes, Villa recalled, seemed to rest on him not as a person, but as a source of information to be measured and contained. The men did not demand violently, they simply stated that it would be best if the photographs were withdrawn. Best for him, best for his family, best for the public. The phrasing was calm, almost courteous, but it left no room for debate. When Villa hesitated, one of them reminded him of details from his private life, his workplace, the route his children walked home from school. Nothing overtly threatening, but enough to plant a seed of unease. Afterward, Villa's confidence wavered. Though some of his photographs continued to circulate in small circles, he grew quieter, less willing to speak openly. Interviews that began with enthusiasm ended with hesitation. He stopped carrying his camera so often, and when he did, he seemed reluctant to discuss the results. For the UFO community, the photographs remained tantalizing, but incomplete. Without the negatives, without Villa's full cooperation, the evidence could never be tested to the satisfaction of skeptics. Supporters pointed to their clarity, their consistency. Detractors pointed to the lack of verifiable chain of custody. In the middle stood Villa himself, once bold, now subdued. Imagine the scene for a moment. A modest home in Albuquerque, a man sitting at his kitchen table, photographs spread before him, the desert sun slanting through the window. He studies the prints, seeing in them the extraordinary proof that the sky holds secrets. And then, the sound of a car pulling up outside. Two men in suits step out, their shoes crunching softly on the gravel. They knock. He opens the door. They enter, polite, calm, precise. They speak for only a few minutes, but when they leave, the weight of the photographs has changed. What was once evidence is now a burden. This is the heart of intimidation. It does not tear the evidence from your hands. It makes you doubt the wisdom of keeping it. It makes you wonder whether truth is worth the price of holding it. Villa's story is one of many, where photographs seem to vanish into silence. Time and again, witnesses who captured tangible images of UFOs reported follow-up visits, negatives misplaced, prints taken, cameras tampered with. Even when nothing physical was taken, the witnesses themselves often withdrew, as if the act of being questioned had erased their certainty. For some, this is the most effective kind of control. You do not need to confiscate every photograph if you can convince the photographer to stop sharing. You do not need to erase every story if you can instill just enough fear that the storyteller falls quiet. Silence once planted grows quickly. As you lie back and listen, imagine the desert sky above New Mexico in the summer of 1963, wide, open, endless. Imagine a man lifting his camera, framing a disc against the blue, pressing the shutter, the click of the lens, the whir of the film advancing, proof perhaps, in his hands. And then, days later, the knock at the door, the calm questions, the pale faces, the certainty that the photographs, no matter how clear, will never fully belong to him again. This was the experience of Paul Villa Jr., a man who reached for truth with his camera, and who found, instead, the quiet weight of intimidation. The story of Paul Villa Jr. was not an isolated one. Across the 1950s and 1960s, similar accounts appeared in the correspondence of researchers and the whispers of witnesses. Time and again, people spoke of capturing something tangible, a photograph, a piece of metal, a clear sketch, only to watch it slip away, not always by theft, but by the subtler currents of intimidation. For many, the photograph was the holy grail. A witness could be mistaken. A memory could blur, but a photograph seemed to promise permanence, a frozen moment of truth. When a disk appeared against a summer sky, when a glowing orb hovered above a ridge, the shutter of a camera felt like a lifeline to credibility. For a few, the photographs developed just as they hoped. Structured objects, luminous forms, something undeniable. But then came the silence. In case after case, negatives were lost, prints were confiscated, cameras themselves were taken for analysis and never returned. And when questions were asked, the answers were vague, evasive, or absent altogether. One early researcher described it this way: "It was as if the evidence itself grew nervous, as if the moment you tried to hold it in your hands, unseen fingers were already loosening your grip." Consider the story of a New England man who captured 3 Polaroids of a bright disk above a lake in the early 1960s. The images, though blurred at the edges, clearly showed a domed structure. When he mailed them to a magazine for review, he received a polite reply. The pictures had been passed on for expert analysis. Months later, no word had come. When he inquired, the editor seemed surprised. No photographs were on file. They had simply vanished. Another account tells of a Midwestern woman who photographed a glowing object above her farm. Days later, 2 men visited, dressed in dark suits, carrying plain identification cards that bore no agency name. They asked calm questions about the photographs, where they were stored, who else had seen them. She handed them the prints, expecting them to be returned after verification. They never were. When she pressed the local sheriff, he shrugged. No one knew who the visitors had been. Patterns like these began to surface in the notes of investigators. Files marked with missing evidence, reports punctuated by phrases like negatives unavailable or originals not returned. The silences were as telling as the sightings themselves, and then there were the subtler forms of suppression. Some witnesses described receiving unexpected phone calls, voices instructing them not to speak further. Others reported that after sharing their photographs, they began to notice cars parked near their homes, the same vehicles appearing at odd hours, always leaving when approached. The message was never explicit, but it was clear enough: someone was watching, and someone preferred silence. Imagine the psychology of that moment. You have in your possession what you believe is proof, a photograph that confirms what your eyes saw. You show it to a friend, to a local paper, to a researcher. Then the questions begin. Who else has seen it? Where is the negative? Are you certain you want to make it public? At first, the questions seem harmless, but then they are followed by silences on the telephone line, by knocks at the door from men who never introduce themselves fully, by the unease of being observed. The photograph, once a source of pride, becomes a source of worry. In the UFO community, this phenomenon became a story in its own right. Researchers began to collect not only photographs, but the testimonies of those who lost them. Some argued that the government had a vested interest in suppressing evidence, fearing public panic or the revelation of classified technology. Others believed the suppression was not human at all, that the very visitors who appeared in the skies had agents or manifestations that worked to conceal their presence. Whether human or not, the result was the same. Silence. The evidence, once bright, dimmed. The witnesses, once eager, grew quiet, and so the cycle continued. Photographs were taken, shared, and lost. Witnesses were questioned, unsettled, and withdrawn. The public, meanwhile, remained caught between skepticism and wonder, never given the chance to weigh the evidence in full. As you rest now, imagine the quiet rooms where these photographs once lay, a kitchen table with prints spread across it, the faint smell of developing chemicals in the air, a researcher's office with envelopes neatly labeled, negatives tucked carefully inside, a moment of triumph, proof at last, and then the knock. The questions, the absence that followed. This was not only the story of Paul Villa Jr., it was the story of many who tried to turn mystery into certainty, only to find that certainty was the very thing that could not be kept. And so the men in black, whether agents of government secrecy or something stranger still, became tied not only to witnesses but to evidence itself. Their presence was felt in what went missing, in what was never returned, in the spaces where photographs should have been but were not. The silence was not only in voices, it was in the gaps in the record, the missing negatives, the vanished prints. Tonight, as we follow this trail, let your thoughts drift with the rhythm of these absences. Imagine the empty envelopes, the missing files, the photographs never shown. Each absence is a kind of presence, a quiet reminder that someone somewhere preferred the truth to remain just out of reach. And in that silence, the legend of intimidation grew stronger. Not every photograph disappeared into the hands of strangers. Not every negative was taken. Sometimes the weapon of intimidation was subtler still, not a knock at the door, but a whisper in the ear, a raised eyebrow, a laugh in the wrong place. For many who tried to share their images of unidentified objects, ridicule was as effective as confiscation. A photograph could be mocked, a witness dismissed, a reputation questioned until the person holding the evidence no longer wished to hold it at all. This form of suppression left no missing files, no official visits, no black sedans parked by the curb. Instead, it left silence in another way, by convincing the witness that speaking again was not worth the cost. Consider the case of a young man in the Midwest who in the summer of 1964 photographed a luminous disk hovering over a stand of trees at twilight. The images, though grainy, were compelling. He brought them to a local newspaper, hopeful that others might confirm the sighting. The editor looked them over, raised a skeptical brow, and quietly filed them away. Days later, the story leaked out in the form of gossip. Co-workers teased him. Neighbors smiled knowingly when he passed. Soon, he withdrew the photographs altogether. They were never published. The ridicule had done its work. Or the story of a woman in California who snapped a series of pictures from her back porch after noticing a glowing form above the mountains. She developed the prints herself, proud of their clarity, and shared them with a small local club. At the next meeting, her images were passed around with muttered comments and polite but dismissive shrugs. One man suggested the glow was nothing more than a porch light reflected on the lens. Another laughed and joked about little green men. The woman, once excited, grew embarrassed. She tucked the prints away, never to bring them out again. Ridicule is quiet, but powerful. It works not by taking away what is in your hands, but by making you wish you had never held it. And in the UFO community of the 1950s and 1960s, ridicule was never far away. The cultural mood was skeptical. Scientists dismissed the subject. Officials mocked it in press releases. Even Project Blue Book, the Air Force's official investigation, often explained away sightings with phrases that bordered on condescension. Swamp gas, weather balloons, astronomical misidentifications. Each phrase was a subtle dismissal, not only of the phenomenon, but of the people who reported it. For those who had seen something real, or believed they had, the sting of ridicule cut deep. A farmer could be made to feel foolish. A mechanic could be painted as gullible. A housewife could be told she had mistaken Venus for a saucer. Each dismissal was a nudge toward silence. In some ways, ridicule was the perfect companion to the more direct forms of intimidation. Not every witness would receive a visit from the men in black, but nearly every witness would encounter disbelief. Together, these forces worked in tandem, the silent knock for some, the mocking smile for others. Both led to the same result: fewer voices speaking, fewer photographs shared, fewer stories told. Imagine the weight of this choice. You stand at the edge of a field, your camera in hand, the memory of a hovering disc still fresh in your mind. You know what you saw, and the photograph in your pocket confirms it. But you also know what might follow. Perhaps a visit, perhaps a car idling in the night, perhaps only the smirk of a neighbor, the doubt in a friend's eyes, the laughter that follows you into the grocery store. You hold the photograph tightly, and you ask yourself, is it worth it? For many, the answer was no. Silence became easier than scorn. This is not to say that every photograph was genuine. Many were mistakes. Some were hoaxes. But what mattered in these stories was not the authenticity of the image, but the effect of the atmosphere surrounding it. Witnesses, whether sincere or mistaken, often faced the same outcome: isolation, doubt, and eventual withdrawal. Researchers noted this pattern and began to write about it. They observed that ridicule functioned as a form of social control, discouraging serious discussion of the subject. One investigator wrote that the ridicule barrier was more effective than any classified program. It required no budget, no agents, no formal orders. It lived in the minds of the public, shaping conversations before they even began. And so, when we speak of intimidation in the world of UFO photography, we must remember that it wore many faces. Sometimes it was the pale man at the door, sometimes it was the missing negative, and sometimes it was the quiet chuckle at the back of the room, the dismissive headline, the phrase swamp gas. As you drift with these thoughts, imagine the witnesses themselves. Picture them alone at night, their prints spread before them, the weight of doubt pressing heavier than the photographs themselves. They look at the images and see what they saw, but they also hear the laughter that has already begun. Slowly, carefully, they place the photographs back into their envelopes, tuck them into drawers, and turn the key. The evidence remains, but the voice behind it has fallen silent. This too is intimidation. It does not need black suits or dark sedans. It needs only the suggestion that speaking will cost you your reputation, your friendships, your peace of mind. And in the history of the UFO mystery, this subtle silence has been as effective as any confiscation. The photographs of Paul Villa Jr., the prints that vanished from mail rooms and offices, the images hidden away in kitchen drawers, all became part of the same pattern. Evidence suppressed, voices quieted, truth left to flicker at the edges of memory. The men in black, whether real or imagined, embodied this atmosphere. They were not only figures who appeared at doors, they were the shadow of ridicule itself, the living face of silence. And so, as this chapter closes, we carry with us the weight of photographs never seen, voices never heard, stories never told. The sky may have been filled with strange lights, but on the ground, silence prevailed. Let your breathing deepen now. Let the thought of those missing photographs drift into the distance, like negatives dissolving into the shadows of a dark room. For the witnesses, the story ended in silence. For us, it becomes another thread in the tapestry of intimidation. Chapter 3. The Farmer's Warning. The setting was quiet, rural, and unremarkable. A rolling pasture in upstate New York, a scattering of barns and sheds, and beyond them the slopes of the Catskill Mountains fading into the distance. It was here, among cows and fences and the routines of a farmer's life, that Gary Wilcox experienced something that would leave him forever unsettled. It was April 24th, 1964, a day that began like so many others. Wilcox rose early, the sun just beginning to lighten the horizon, the air still cool with the last touch of night. He walked his land, inspecting fences, checking on the soil that he worked with patience each year. The fields were quiet, dew clinging to blades of grass, the world carrying the stillness that often comes before the bustle of daylight. As he moved across one of his pastures, Wilcox noticed something unusual. A metallic shape rested on the slope, half hidden in the early morning haze. At first glance, it looked like a piece of farm equipment, perhaps a fuel tank or a storage container, something that had been misplaced or abandoned. But as he drew closer, its strangeness grew. The object was oval, its surface smooth, its proportions too deliberate to be discarded machinery. It sat on the ground with an ease that seemed unnatural, as though it belonged there, and yet did not. Wilcox later described the object as about 20 feet long, oval-shaped, with a dull metallic sheen. It had no seams, no rivets, no windows, just a silent, gleaming form resting in his field. Curiosity, pulled him nearer. As he approached, he felt a stillness settle over the pasture, the usual hum of morning birds seeming to fade. And then, from the object, figures emerged. Two beings, small in stature, their forms slender, their movements precise. They wore what looked like metallic suits that shimmered faintly in the light. Their heads were slightly larger than their bodies suggested, and their eyes, dark, wide, and unblinking, fixed upon him. The encounter, Wilcox recalled, was not terrifying. It was calm. The beings spoke to him, not in words he heard with his ears, but in impressions that seemed to bloom directly in his mind. They told him of their origins, of a planet not far in cosmic terms, and of their interest in Earth's environment. They seemed curious about farming, about the soil beneath his feet, about the food humans grew. The farmer, steady and plain-spoken, responded as best he could. He described how he tended the land, how he planted crops, how the seasons shaped his work. He even offered to bring them fertilizer, thinking it might help them understand. The conversation was surreal, yet strangely ordinary, two worlds meeting across the furrows of a quiet field, and then, just as calmly, the visitors returned to their craft. The object rose silently, hovered for a moment, and then vanished into the sky, with a speed that left the pasture empty once more. Wilcox stood in the field, his boots damp with dew, his heart steady, but his mind racing. He had spoken with beings not of this earth, or so he believed, and their words lingered. He kept the experience close at first, telling only a few, but eventually his story spread. Local papers covered it, and soon researchers were visiting his farm, eager to hear every detail. But the story did not end there. Weeks after the encounter, Wilcox reported that he began to feel watched. A car he did not recognize, parked near his farm. Strangers in formal attire appeared at his door, asking calm, measured questions. They wanted to know about the craft, about the beings, about his conversation. Their tone was polite, but their presence was heavy. The men reminded him, in subtle ways, that it might be best not to speak further. They did not issue threats, they did not shout, but their words carried weight, as though silence itself were being pressed into him. Wilcox, a farmer who had faced storms, blight, and the stubbornness of soil, found himself shaken in a way no season of farming had ever left him. Over time, his voice grew quieter. He stopped speaking so openly of what he had seen. The pasture returned to its routine, the cows grazing, the soil tilled, the seasons passing. But the memory remained, heavy as the morning mist. For the UFO community, Wilcox's story was remarkable. A farmer, unconnected to research circles, describing an encounter that was detailed, calm, and consistent with accounts from other witnesses. But equally remarkable was the aftermath. The presence of men who came afterward, who seemed to embody authority without explanation, and who left behind not clarity, but silence. As you listen now, picture the scene, the early morning light spreading across the Catskills. The farmer, standing in his pasture, boots sinking slightly into damp earth. The oval craft gleaming faintly in the sun. The small beings, their dark eyes fixed upon him, asking about soil, about crops, about life. And then, the quiet returned to normal. Cows in the distance, the hum of the day resuming, until the knock at the door, the men in suits, the questions that felt less like curiosity and more like instruction. This was the experience of Gary Wilcox, an ordinary man, given an extraordinary encounter, and then reminded, gently but firmly, that some stories are not meant to be told too loudly. In the world of UFO encounters, rural landscapes often provide the stage. Wide skies, open fields, and quiet nights leave room for strange lights to appear without distraction. For many farmers, ranchers, and small-town residents, the sky was not a curiosity glimpsed between buildings. It was an everyday companion. They rose with it in the morning, worked beneath it through the day, and watched it settle into star-filled silence at night. But this closeness to the sky also meant that when something unusual happened, it was often rural people who saw it first, and when intimidation followed, it was they who felt its weight most sharply. Unlike researchers in cities, rural witnesses often stood alone. They had no networks, no circles of colleagues to support them. Their stories were told in kitchen conversations, in quiet visits to local sheriffs, or in hesitant letters written late at night. When ridicule came, it was not abstract. It came from neighbors, friends, and family. And when visitors in dark suits appeared, there was no one else to confirm or defend. Gary Wilcox's experience captured this vulnerability clearly. Here was a man whose life revolved around soil, crops, and seasons. He was not a writer, not a lecturer, not someone seeking publicity. His world was measured in acres and harvests, in the cycles of planting and tending. And yet, when he spoke of beings who asked him about farming, his words carried the quiet authenticity of someone grounded in the earth. But when the men in black came, their questions pierced that simple life. They wanted to know details: what the beings had said, what he had done with the fertilizer he offered, whether he had spoken to outsiders. Their calm but insistent presence suggested that what had seemed like a private encounter was now the property of someone else. For Wilcox, the intrusion was not only unsettling, it was alien in its own way. He could mend fences, plow fields, and face down storms, but he had no defense against authority that arrived without name or badge. His neighbors might gossip, but these men carried something heavier than gossip. They carried the aura of control. Other rural witnesses told similar stories. In Canada, a logger described seeing a metallic craft descend into a clearing, only to receive visits later from men who spoke of his family and his work with unnerving precision. In the American South, a couple living near a cotton field reported strange lights at night. Within days, strangers appeared in town, asking locals about them, as if compiling a quiet dossier. For people whose lives were simple and rooted, these visits felt overwhelming. There were no lawyers to call, no agencies to contact, no way to know who the strangers truly were. The safest path was silence. This is why so many rural stories remained whispers. They were told in fragments, to trusted friends, to family members who promised not to laugh. Sometimes they reached researchers, scribbled in letters that began with apologies. "You may not believe this. I hesitate to write. Please keep my name private." And often those letters ended with resignation. "I will not speak of this again." The intimidation worked not because it was forceful, but because it was unanswerable. When a man in a dark suit tells a farmer to remain quiet, what can the farmer do? To speak louder is to invite ridicule from neighbors and more visits from strangers. To fall silent is to protect one's peace. Imagine Wilcox again, sitting at his kitchen table at dusk, the day's work done, the smell of soil still clinging to his boots. Outside, the fields are settling into night. In the distance, a car passes slowly, its headlights dim. He glances at it, uneasy, wondering if it will stop at his gate. He remembers the questions, the pale faces, the way they seem to already know his answers, and he chooses not to speak of the beings again, not to his neighbors, not to the reporters, perhaps not even to his children. That silence becomes its own form of evidence. Evidence not of the craft, but of the pressure that follows. In the broader history of UFO research, rural witnesses like Wilcox are often overlooked. Their stories were harder to verify, their voices quieter, their means of recording evidence limited. Yet, time and again, these voices carried striking similarities. Encounters in fields, conversations with strangers, visits afterward that pressed them into quiet. Researchers who gathered these stories noticed the pattern. They saw how intimidation fell most heavily on those least able to resist. A professor might push back, a journalist might publish regardless, but a farmer, a rancher, a small-town teacher, Their best defense was silence. And so, the men in black became not only figures of authority, but figures of isolation. Their presence was magnified in rural landscapes, where the sky was wide, the witnesses few, and the silence easiest to enforce. As you listen now, picture the countryside at night. A farmhouse window glowing softly, fields stretching outward into darkness, the faint hum of an engine approaching, then fading again. For the family inside, every sound carries weight. Was it only a passing car, or was it a reminder that their story is not theirs to tell? This is how intimidation worked in the farmlands and small towns, quietly, subtly, effectively. Each silence became another thread in the tapestry of the Men in Black legend, and in that silence, the mystery endured. The stories of men like Gary Wilcox echoed quietly through the UFO community. They were not front-page news, not celebrated in magazines, not debated in the halls of science. Instead, they lived in letters, in the margins of research files, in the memories of small-town conversations. And yet, to those who paid attention, the pattern was clear. Rural witnesses, farmers, ranchers, loggers, small-town teachers, often spoke once, hesitantly, and then fell silent. At first, researchers chalked this silence up to fear of ridicule. Country communities could be harsh with gossip. A single story about a flying saucer could become a joke told for years in diners and feed stores. But as accounts accumulated, another possibility emerged. Perhaps the silence was not only social, but encouraged. Perhaps the Men in Black were not random apparitions, but part of a larger system, one in which silence itself was cultivated like a crop. Consider how many of these rural stories followed the same rhythm. A sighting in a field, a strange object, metallic and silent, a being, or sometimes more than one. Then, a conversation, words spoken aloud or impressions left in the mind. For a moment, the witness was swept into something extraordinary. They carried it home, heavy with wonder. And then, the interruption. A car arriving at dusk, strangers at the door, calm questions that seemed to already know the answers. Advice, given without threat, but with an unmistakable edge. Perhaps it is best not to speak further. This rhythm repeated enough times that researchers began to see intimidation not as incidental, but as deliberate. Silence was not a byproduct. It was the harvest. One investigator described it this way. The phenomenon feeds on silence. Every story suppressed becomes part of the control. Every witness who falls quiet keeps the curtain drawn. To the farmers themselves, this realization came slowly. At first, they thought they were alone, singled out. But when their accounts reached researchers, the parallels became undeniable. Different towns, different fields, different years, yet the same figures, the same cars, the same aftermath. Imagine yourself, then, as one of these witnesses. You are a farmer, your life tied to the rhythm of planting and harvest. One morning, you see something extraordinary. You tell your family. Perhaps you tell a neighbor. Then days later, you notice a car parked at the end of your lane. Two men step out, their suits dark, their expressions unreadable. They ask questions you did not expect. They mention details of your life that you did not share. Their voices remain calm, but their meaning is clear. Speak no further. When they leave, the fields are quiet again, but you are changed. The sky above you no longer feels open, it feels watched. The land beneath your boots no longer feels only yours, it feels surveyed. You choose silence, not because you are weak, but because you wish to keep the rest of your life untouched. For researchers, these silences became a second kind of evidence. They could not hold it in their hands like a photograph. They could not display it in a file like a piece of debris. But they could sense it in the patterns, the sudden withdrawal, the voices that fell quiet, the stories that stopped mid-sentence. The silence itself became a testimony. And yet, this testimony was difficult to share. How does one prove absence? How does one collect the quiet where words should be? For skeptics, the silence was proof of nothing at all. For believers, it was proof of everything. As the 1960s deepened, this paradox grew. The UFO phenomenon continued. Lights in the sky, craft over highways, encounters in forests. But around every story hovered the possibility of suppression. Witnesses hesitated to come forward. Those who did were often mocked, and behind it all, the men in black loomed as symbols of a larger machinery of silence. Some researchers began to speak of this openly. They wrote of the culture of intimidation, of the way fear and ridicule combined to stifle voices before they could join together. They argued that the men in black were not simply strange visitors. They were part of a system designed to harvest silence, to ensure that the extraordinary remained fragmented, scattered, and easily dismissed. To the rural witnesses, these reflections were distant. Their lives returned to their fields, their barns, their crops, but the unease remained. A glance at a passing car, a hesitation before telling a story, a drawer closed firmly on a notebook of sketches. This too is a form of harvest, not of corn or wheat, but of memory, not of grain, but of silence. As you listen now, let your thoughts drift to those quiet farms and fields. Imagine the wide skies above them, endless and unbroken. Imagine the witnesses standing in their pastures, looking upward, seeing something extraordinary. And then imagine the quiet afterward, the silence at the dinner table, the lowered voices, the decision not to speak again. That silence was not empty. It was filled with weight, with presence, with the lingering impression of pale men in dark suits who carried authority without name. This is what intimidation yielded in the countryside. Not shattered lives, not broken doors, but a harvest of silence that grew year after year, field after field. And so as we leave the world of the farmer behind, we carry with us not only the memory of Gary Wilcox and his strange visitors, but the broader truth that rural witnesses, more than most, became the quiet custodians of experiences they could not share. Their silence was not weakness, it was survival. The men in black did not need to shout in those fields. They needed only to stand, to ask, to remind, and the rest was done by silence itself. Chapter 4. The Roadside Encounter. Some encounters do not happen in the sky or in the solitude of fields. They unfold suddenly, in the ordinary motion of everyday life, on a quiet highway, headlights sweeping across asphalt, the hum of an engine steady beneath the night. It was the summer of 1973 in Toledo, Ohio, when a man named Robert Richardson had such an encounter. He was not a farmer, not a researcher, not someone who had long pursued the UFO mystery. He was simply driving home, the late hour pressing softly upon his shoulders, his thoughts wandering in the way they often do when the road is long and the night is quiet. The highway stretched before him, empty, lined with trees that swayed faintly in the warm evening air. The rhythm of tires on pavement was steady, hypnotic, and then, without warning, the ordinary gave way to the extraordinary. Richardson saw a metallic object directly ahead of him, blocking the road. It was low, gleaming faintly in his headlights, its surface curved and seamless. At first, he thought it must be a vehicle, perhaps a truck or a trailer that had jackknifed across the lane. But as he braked, heart thudding, he realized its shape was wrong, its presence too silent, its structure unlike anything he recognized. He swerved, but not quickly enough. There was a jolt, the sound of impact, the brief chaos of a car striking something solid. His vehicle shuddered, skidded, and came to a halt. The object ahead shimmered strangely, almost as if dissolving, and then, impossibly, it vanished. One moment it was there, blocking the road, gleaming under his headlights. The next, it was gone. Richardson sat in stunned silence, his hands gripping the wheel, his breath unsteady. The road stretched empty before him once more. No wreckage, no debris, nothing but the echo of the collision still vibrating in his bones. But when he climbed out to inspect the scene, he found something. On the asphalt, near the point of impact, lay a fragment, small, metallic, oddly shaped. He picked it up, turning it over in his hand. It was lightweight, cool to the touch, and unlike any material he had handled before. Whatever had disappeared from the road, this piece remained. He placed it in his car and drove home, mind racing. The following day, Richardson shared his experience with a small group of local UFO enthusiasts. They urged him to safeguard the fragment, to perhaps allow it to be analyzed. It seemed, after all, like the rarest of things, physical evidence, proof that the extraordinary was not only visible, but tangible. But then, the story shifted. Within days, Richardson reported receiving visitors. 2 men arrived at his home, dressed in dark suits, their expressions unreadable. They asked about the incident, about the fragment, about who else he had told. Their voices were calm, clipped, professional, but the questions carried weight. Richardson answered cautiously, describing the event as best he could. He admitted that he had turned the fragment over to a local laboratory for testing. At this the men grew more insistent. They asked where the lab was, who was analyzing the material, and when it would be returned. And then came the words that turned curiosity into intimidation. The men told him, quietly, that it would be in his best interest to recover the fragment. They implied that his safety, and that of his wife, depended on it. Their tone remained polite, but beneath the politeness lay steel. Richardson explained that the lab had already misplaced the fragment, that it was no longer in his possession. The men did not argue, they simply repeated that it would be better for him if he produced it. Then they left, their black car, pulling away silently into the night. Afterward, Richardson felt the weight of their visit settle upon him. The fragment was gone. The laboratory never returned it, offering only vague explanations about records misplaced, and the men never came back. But their presence lingered, their words echoing in his mind. He had seen something extraordinary. He had held a piece of it in his hands, and now both the object and his certainty had been taken from him. For the UFO community, Richardson's story was chilling. It combined the extraordinary, a collision with a vanishing craft, with the familiar pattern of intimidation. Physical evidence, the rarest commodity in these mysteries, had once again slipped beyond reach, not through accident alone, but through pressure. Imagine yourself on that Ohio road. Your headlights sweep across the asphalt, the night air carrying the faint scent of summer. Suddenly, the object looms before you, metallic, silent, impossible. The collision jolts you, your heart leaps, and then, in the blink of an eye, the object is gone. You stand in the quiet road, holding a fragment that feels like proof. And then, days later, the knock at the door, the men in suits, the questions that seem less like curiosity and more like command. This is how intimidation works, not by tearing the fragment from your hands in that moment, but by ensuring it never returns, by ensuring that even with evidence, you are left only with silence. For Richardson, the story never resolved. The fragment never reappeared. The lab's records were incomplete, the men's identities unknown. What remained was the memory of the road, the jolt of the collision, and the calm, quiet words that reminded him how fragile his sense of ownership truly was. And in that fragility, the Men in Black legend deepened. In most accounts of the Men in Black, there are no raised voices, no drawn weapons, no scenes of open confrontation. Instead, there is something quieter, and perhaps more chilling, the art of the implied threat. A phrase left hanging, a reminder spoken in passing, a detail about one's life offered casually by a stranger who should not know it. Robert Richardson's encounter in Ohio revealed this pattern clearly. When the men in suits asked about the fragment he had found, their tone was not hostile. They did not pound the table or brandish credentials. Instead, they reminded him, calmly, evenly, that it would be better for him and for his wife if the object was returned. No anger, no overt menace, just a statement that carried weight, because of what was left unsaid. This is the language of intimidation. It thrives in ambiguity, forcing the witness to imagine the consequences rather than spelling them out. The words are simple. The meaning is heavy. Other witnesses have described similar experiences. A man in New Jersey, after reporting a close encounter, was visited by two men who asked polite questions about his testimony. As they prepared to leave, one of them paused, looked him directly in the eye, and said, "It would be wise to forget this conversation ever happened." Then they stepped into their sedan and drove away. The man was left in his doorway, the words echoing in his ears. He never spoke publicly of his sighting again. In another case, a family in the Midwest claimed to have seen lights land near their property. Days later, two strangers appeared, tall and pale, their suits immaculate. They spoke gently to the family, asking about what had been seen. Before leaving, one of them remarked that children often had vivid imaginations, and wouldn't it be a shame if the neighbors thought the family's children were liars. The message was clear: continue speaking, and the reputation of the children might suffer. The family remained silent. These threats did not need to be violent. They worked because they touched something personal: safety, family, reputation. The witnesses, often ordinary people unused to public attention, found the cost of speaking far too high. Psychologists who later studied these stories noted that this form of intimidation was effective precisely because it left no clear act to report. If a man is assaulted, he can call the police. If property is damaged, he can file a claim. But when two strangers simply suggest that silence is wise, what is there to report? Who would believe it? The intimidation becomes self-sealing, effective, but invisible. For the UFO community, this was both frustrating and revealing. It meant that many of the most detailed stories never reached the public, not because they lacked substance, but because the witnesses chose silence. And it meant that the men in black were not merely shadowy figures at doorsteps. They were practitioners of a subtler art, the cultivation of doubt and fear through words alone. Imagine yourself in that position. You hold in your memory an extraordinary event, a disc, a fragment, a moment that proves the sky holds secrets. You want to share it, to find others who will listen, and then two men appear. They know your name, your address, perhaps even the route your spouse takes to work. They never raise their voices. They never threaten directly, but when they leave, you no longer feel that the story is yours to tell. This is how intimidation functions at its most refined. It requires no force, no evidence, no confrontation. It requires only presence, timing, and words chosen with precision. The Richardson case illustrates this perfectly. The fragment he found, the piece that might have been evidence, was lost to a laboratory's confusion, or perhaps to something more deliberate. But what mattered most was not the fragment's disappearance. It was the conversation that followed. The suggestion that his safety and his wife's safety depended on his compliance. That was the lasting weight. Over time, researchers began to collect these subtler accounts. They found that nearly every story carried echoes of the same language. Phrases like, "It would be better if," or "You should forget this," or "Think of your family." Always calm, always polite, always leaving the burden of imagination to the witness. This method of intimidation, some argued, was more effective than open threats could ever be. Open threats invite resistance, anger, or a call for help. Implied threats invite compliance. They make the witness question not only their memory, but their judgment. Was it really a warning? Was it just a figure of speech? Am I overreacting? In that confusion, silence grows, and so, in story after story, silence followed. The photographs were withheld. The letters were never sent. The voices fell quiet. The fragments, whether physical or remembered, slipped away. As you rest now, picture Richardson's Ohio highway once more. The night stretched out, the trees whispering in the summer air. The fragment in his hand, cool and metallic, felt like proof. And then, days later, the calm voices at his door, reminding him, without saying it outright, that proof was not his to keep. This is the pattern we see again and again. Not violence, not confrontation, only presence, questions, and the quiet power of words that do not need to be explained. And in those words, the men in black left their deepest mark. The 1970s were years marked by contrasts. On one side, the promise of progress, astronauts walked on the moon, satellites orbited the Earth, and computers began to step into everyday life. On the other, an undercurrent of suspicion and unease. The Cold War was at its height, intelligence agencies worked in shadows, and secrecy was woven into the very fabric of government operations. It was into this atmosphere that Robert Richardson's story fit with uncanny precision. A motorist collides with a craft on an Ohio highway, retrieves a fragment, and days later receives a visit from strangers who embody authority without ever naming it. For those who lived in the era, the story resonated because it mirrored what they already knew. Governments kept secrets, and those secrets were often enforced with silence. The Cold War created a climate where intimidation was expected, if not accepted. Citizens were warned constantly about espionage, about agents working in plain sight, about the need for vigilance. Stories of surveillance and quiet visits by officials were part of the cultural background. Against this backdrop, the men in black did not seem impossible, they seemed inevitable. Researchers at the time noted that the details of men in black encounters often echoed the methods of real-world intelligence operations. The calm questioning, the implied authority, the suggestion that safety depended on silence. These were tactics familiar to those who studied counterintelligence. But the strange appearance of the visitors, their pale faces, their mechanical tones, their odd timing, suggested something more than ordinary agents. For Richardson, and for others like him, this ambiguity was the hardest part. If the men had presented clear identification, if they had claimed to be from the Air Force or the FBI, he might have known how to respond. But they offered nothing, no names, no agencies, only the aura of authority. In the Cold War world, where secret agencies were said to be everywhere, that aura was often enough. Imagine living in that climate. You turn on the evening news, and the stories speak of spies uncovered, of classified programs revealed, of shadow wars fought in silence. You open the newspaper, and between articles about foreign policy and domestic unrest, you find columns about unidentified flying objects. And then, one night, you see something extraordinary yourself, a craft, a fragment, a moment that defies explanation. The next day, two strangers arrive, dressed in suits, speaking calmly, reminding you of what is best. Would you question them, or would you accept that in a world already filled with secrets, this too must remain hidden? This is how the Cold War amplified the power of intimidation. It created a culture in which secrecy was assumed, in which silence was the safest path, in which authority did not need to explain itself to be obeyed. The UFO community felt this tension keenly. Many researchers believed that the government's own investigations, Project Sign, Project Grudge, Project Blue Book, were less about discovering truth and more about managing perception. When witnesses spoke of strange craft, official explanations were quick to follow: weather balloons, misidentified stars, atmospheric illusions. These explanations reassured the public, but they did little to comfort those who had seen something undeniable. And when those witnesses also reported visits by pale-faced men in black suits, the official explanations seemed thinner still. Why would agents go to such lengths to suppress stories if they were nothing more than balloons and stars? Why would fragments vanish from laboratories, photographs disappear from files, witnesses fall silent? The contradiction deepened the mystery. To many, the men in black became a symbol of that contradiction, the living embodiment of Cold War secrecy projected into the UFO mystery. They were not only visitors to witnesses, they were the shadow of an era. Consider again Richardson's roadside encounter. On its own, it might have been dismissed as a strange accident, a moment of confusion on a dark highway. But placed against the backdrop of the 1970s, it took on a sharper edge. The fragment he found was not just a piece of metal. It was a symbol of a world where evidence could vanish, where silence could be enforced, where the extraordinary brushed against the ordinary, only to be pulled swiftly back into the shadows. And Richardson was not alone. Other motorists, pilots, and rural witnesses reported the same sequence, an extraordinary event, followed by a visit, followed by silence. Each story added another thread to the tapestry of intimidation, weaving it tightly into the culture of secrecy that defined the age. As you listen now, let the imagery of that era drift gently through your thoughts. Picture the headlines about espionage and space travel. Imagine the hum of televisions in living rooms, the voices of news anchors speaking of secrets behind closed doors. Picture the highways at night, long stretches of pavement lined with dark trees, the headlights of lone cars sweeping forward into the unknown. Somewhere along those roads, an object appears, a collision occurs, a fragment remains, and then, days later, the quiet knock at the door. The Cold War may have ended decades ago, but the atmosphere it created lingers in these stories. An atmosphere where silence was cultivated, where intimidation thrived, where ordinary citizens learned to live with the knowledge that some truths were not meant to be spoken aloud. For Robert Richardson, the silence never lifted, the fragment never returned. His story joined the countless others that remained suspended between belief and dismissal, evidence and absence, memory and myth. And through it all, the men in black remained, not only as visitors in black suits, but as symbols of a world where secrecy was as common as the air, and silence was the safest harvest. Chapter 5. Inside the military machine. Not all stories of intimidation come from farmers, motorists, or photographers. Some come from within the walls of the institutions themselves. From men and women who served in uniform, who worked behind locked doors, who swore oaths of secrecy. These are voices that speak not from the outside looking in, but from the inside looking out. One such voice was Dan Sherman, a technical sergeant in the United States Air Force during the 1980s and 1990s. Sherman's career began like many others, a steady progression through training, assignments, and duties that built upon his skill with electronics and communications. He was, by all accounts, capable and dedicated, someone who took pride in serving his country. But according to Sherman, his career path eventually took a turn into territory he had never expected, a program so secret, so extraordinary, that it blurred the line between military duty and something far stranger. Sherman later described his experience in a book titled Above Black. In it, he claimed that while stationed at a communications facility, he was quietly selected for a classified assignment. The task was not to monitor enemy transmissions, nor to operate satellites. It was instead to serve as an intermediary in what was called Project Preserve Destiny, a program designed to communicate with non-human intelligences. The story, as Sherman told it, unfolded with the careful, deliberate structure of military procedure. He was trained to use a specialized console, instructed on protocols, and told that his role was to receive and interpret information not from humans, but from entities that existed outside ordinary understanding. He described the process as a kind of telepathic interface, a channel that allowed impressions to pass between worlds. At first, Sherman performed his duties with the discipline expected of an airman. But the more he participated, the more questions he carried. Who were these beings? Why was the Air Force communicating with them? What purpose did the program serve? When he asked, the answers were curt, dismissive, or absent. His superiors reminded him of his oath, of the classified nature of the work, of the consequences of speaking too freely. The atmosphere was one of strict control, but also of something heavier, an unspoken pressure that went beyond ordinary secrecy. Sherman began to feel that he was not only keeping secrets from the public, but from himself. He was a participant in a program that withheld its purpose even from those inside it. The silence around him grew oppressive. Later, when Sherman decided to go public, he described the subtle but unmistakable forms of intimidation he encountered. Meetings that ended with warnings, conversations in which his loyalty was questioned, casual remarks that carried the weight of threat. He was reminded that his career, his benefits, even his safety, could be jeopardized if he chose to reveal too much. And yet he did speak. He wrote his book. He told his story. But the cost, he admitted, was heavy. His credibility was questioned. His service was scrutinized, and in the quiet hours of night, he felt the weight of unseen eyes. Sherman's account is unusual in the world of UFO lore because it bridges two worlds. On one side, the civilian witnesses, the farmers, the motorists, the photographers who encountered the men in black after glimpsing the extraordinary. On the other, the insiders, those within the machinery of secrecy, who described intimidation not at the doorstep, but within the chain of command. For Sherman, the intimidation was woven into the structure itself. It did not arrive in black cars or pale faces. It arrived in memorandums, in briefings, in the tone of superiors who reminded him of what was at stake. It arrived in the knowledge that stepping outside the bounds of silence was not only disobedience, but a risk to everything he had built. Imagine his position, a man in uniform, bound by oath, sitting at a console in a locked facility. He receives impressions, messages, data points that flow from somewhere beyond. He is told to record them, to transmit them, to never ask why. When curiosity rises, it is met with the stern gaze of a superior who reminds him that loyalty means silence. And later, when he dares to consider speaking, the reminders grow sharper. Think of your career, think of your family, think of the consequences. This too is intimidation. Not with fists, not with shouting, but with the machinery of an institution that can silence without lifting a hand. For researchers, Sherman's story was both compelling and troubling. It suggested that the men in black, as archetypes of intimidation, were not confined to rural fields or suburban homes. Their presence, in another form, existed within the walls of the very organizations meant to defend the nation. Whether literal men in suits or the faceless weight of classified authority, the effect was the same: silence enforced, truth withheld, questions unanswered. As you lie back and listen, let the image of Sherman's story drift gently into your imagination. Picture a dimly lit communications room, the glow of monitors casting pale light on a solitary figure at his console. Outside, the world is unaware. Inside, impressions flow from sources unnamed. And in the background, the quiet hum of intimidation, not loud, not violent, but constant, like the low buzz of a fluorescent lamp that never turns off. This was Sherman's world, a world where secrecy was total, where silence was demanded, and where intimidation was part of the very air he breathed. When we think of intimidation, we often picture the strangers at the door, the dark sedan parked just out of sight, the polite but unsettling questions. Yet for many insiders, those who worked within the walls of classified programs, the intimidation was subtler and more insidious. It came not from the outside, but from within. Whistleblowers in the world of UFO secrecy have long described a familiar pattern. At first, they are drawn into projects with the promise of serving something greater. They are told their work is essential, that they are protecting national security, that their silence ensures stability. For a while, that sense of duty carries them. But as questions build, as curiosity grows, as the weight of secrecy presses heavier, some begin to consider speaking out. And that is when the pressure sharpens. The stories differ in detail, but the rhythm is often the same. A casual conversation with a supervisor ends with an oddly specific reminder about loyalty. A phone call after hours lingers just a little too long before disconnecting. A career path that once looked promising suddenly stalls. A clearance review becomes more difficult. A promotion that seemed certain disappears. Each act on its own could be dismissed as coincidence, but together they form a pattern of control. One former radar operator described it plainly. They never had to tell me not to talk. They just reminded me, again and again, how quickly a career could unravel if I made the wrong choice. Others spoke of surveillance, cars that followed them a little too closely, mail that arrived already opened, friends or colleagues who suddenly grew distant, as though warned away. These were not violent confrontations. They were whispers, shadows, reminders that the institution could reach into every corner of their lives. For many insiders, this form of intimidation was worse than the stories of pale-faced visitors in suits. Those, at least, could be dismissed as folklore. But when your paycheck, your pension, your very livelihood is on the line, silence becomes not only easier, but almost inevitable. Imagine, for a moment, the weight of that decision. You sit in a secure room, working on a project you know the public would find extraordinary. You feel the urge to share what you know, if only to lighten the burden of secrecy. But then you remember the unspoken warnings. You recall the stalled promotion, the colleague reassigned without explanation, the supervisor's quiet reminder that loyalty has its rewards. You picture your family, your home, your future, and you fold the thought away, locking it as tightly as the vaults that hold the files you once wanted to share. Researchers who gathered these accounts began to see intimidation not as isolated incidents, but as part of a systematic structure of silence. Whistleblowers who tried to step forward often described similar consequences: reputations questioned, finances strained, personal lives disrupted. The intimidation was not only external, it was institutional, built into the machinery of secrecy itself. Some who did speak out found themselves marginalized. Their claims were dismissed, their credibility attacked, their careers ended prematurely. Others simply disappeared from the conversation, retreating into silence after brushes with consequences too personal to risk again. It was in this climate that the legend of the men in black expanded beyond the doorstep. They were no longer only the pale figures who visited farmers and motorists. They became a symbol of the faceless authority that insiders faced every day. The same pressure, the same atmosphere, the same result: silence. Dan Sherman's story sits within this context. His account of being trained to communicate with non-human intelligences was extraordinary. But equally telling was the way he described the subtle pressures that followed him, the reminders that his loyalty was not optional, the warnings that his future depended on his silence. His experience was not unique. It echoed the accounts of countless others who lived in the crosshairs of secrecy. And so, intimidation within the system was not about sudden shocks or overt violence. It was about the slow grind of control, the steady reminder that one's life, one's career, one's identity were tied to silence. To break that silence was to risk everything. As you rest with these thoughts, picture the quiet corridors of military bases, the locked doors of research facilities, the glow of monitors in secured rooms. Behind those walls, men and women worked diligently, many of them ordinary in their ambitions, extraordinary only in the secrets they carried. Imagine their unease as they considered sharing what they knew, only to feel the heavy hand of unseen authority guiding them back into silence. This is intimidation, not by strangers, but by the very institutions that claim to protect. It is the weight of a system designed not only to manage information, but to control voices, and in that silence, the truth, whatever it may be, remains hidden. For the witnesses outside, intimidation arrived in the form of strangers at the door. For the insiders, it came through policies, reviews, and whispered reminders. Different methods, same outcome, a silence that deepened with each passing year. And so, as this section closes, we see the men in black less as individuals and more as archetypes of control. They represent not only the figures in suits, but the faceless machinery that ensures silence at every level. Whether standing in a farmhouse doorway or leaning across a military desk, their message is the same: some truths are not yours to tell. By the time the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, the world of UFO secrecy had grown into a labyrinth. Government projects shifted names from Sign to Grudge to Blue Book, while classified files piled up in archives few would ever see. Whistleblowers stepped forward, some quietly, some loudly, each describing fragments of programs that seemed to stretch just beyond the edge of comprehension. And behind their voices, always, lay the shadow of intimidation. What made this intimidation so curious and so troubling was its blurred identity. Was it purely human? Was it the work of agencies determined to keep secrets for national security? Or was there something else, something not entirely human, woven into the very fabric of silence? Insiders like Dan Sherman described both. On the one hand, they encountered the familiar machinery of military secrecy, clearances, classified briefings, the steady weight of institutional control. On the other hand, they described impressions, communications, and pressures that felt less like human orders and more like something deeper, more alien. Sherman spoke of messages that bypassed words, impressions that pressed directly into thought. He felt guided, not only by commanders, but by forces whose presence he could not see. Other whistleblowers told similar stories. Some claimed that during their service, they experienced dreams that felt implanted, visions that arrived unbidden, or thoughts that seemed to carry the weight of someone else's intention. These experiences were not accompanied by black sedans or pale-faced visitors, but they carried the same effect, a reminder that silence was required, that speaking was dangerous, that truth was not theirs to hold freely. In this way, intimidation within institutions blurred the line between the psychological and the paranormal. Was the pressure felt by insiders merely the weight of authority, or was it amplified by something stranger, something that reached into the mind itself? Researchers debated this fiercely. Some insisted it was all too human, that intelligence agencies had perfected the art of intimidation, and nothing more was needed. Others argued that the consistency of strange impressions, the sense of being guided or monitored from within, suggested a non-human element. Perhaps the men in black were not only operatives in dark suits, but manifestations of something less tangible, entities that moved through both bureaucracy and thought alike. For the insiders, the distinction hardly mattered. What mattered was the effect. They felt watched, they felt controlled, they felt their voices pressed into silence, not only by superiors, but by a force that seemed larger than the institution itself. Imagine sitting in a secure facility, your workday ending, the hum of equipment fading into the quiet. You prepare to leave, but as you gather your things you feel a thought not your own. Do not share this. You shrug it off, tell yourself it is only nerves. But the impression lingers, heavy, undeniable. Later, at home, you sit with family, laughter filling the room, and still the impression remains. Do not share this. No agent needed to arrive at your door. The silence has already been planted inside you. For some, this was the most frightening form of intimidation, not the threat to careers, not the stalled promotions, but the sense that the very boundary of their thoughts had been crossed, that silence was not only external, but internal. And yet, even in the face of this, some spoke. Whistleblowers like Sherman risked their reputations, their careers, their futures to put their experiences into words. They wrote books, gave interviews, reached out to researchers. Their stories were often ridiculed, sometimes ignored, but they added new layers to the Men in Black myth. They suggested that intimidation was not only a tool of governments, it was something larger, a web of control that spanned institutions, communities, and even the private recesses of the mind. For the UFO community, these voices were both inspiring and unsettling. Inspiring because they confirmed suspicions that the phenomenon was taken seriously behind closed doors. Unsettling because they suggested that the machinery of silence was stronger and stranger than anyone imagined. As you lie back and listen, let this blur settle gently into your thoughts. Picture the corridors of military bases, the locked doors of laboratories, the figures in uniforms and suits who enforce silence. And then, picture something less tangible, a pressure in the air, a thought unspoken yet undeniable, a presence that does not knock at the door because it does not need to. The intimidation exists already, quietly, inside. This is where the Men in Black legend stretches beyond folklore. They are not only visitors in sedans, they are not only agents of secrecy, they are symbols of the blurred boundary between human control and something greater. Whether government operatives, psychological archetypes, or manifestations of a non-human intelligence, their effect is the same: silence. And in that silence, the mystery endures. As Chapter 5 closes, we carry forward a new understanding. Intimidation is not always external. Sometimes it is institutional, sometimes it is personal, and sometimes it may be something stranger still, a shadow that moves not only across roads and fields, but across the human mind. Chapter 6: Patterns of Control. This pattern is what gives the Men in Black myth its strange endurance. It is not one man's story, nor one town's folklore. It is a series of threads woven across decades and continents, forming a tapestry too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. The figures may change, the details may shift, but the shape of the silence remains the same. Consider Albert Bender in Connecticut, 1953. A researcher, eager and organized, suddenly withdraws after visitors arrive. His voice falls quiet, his organization dissolves, the silence spreads outward. Consider Paul Villa in New Mexico, 1963. A photographer captures some of the clearest images of UFOs in his era. Strangers appear, ask calm questions, remind him of his family. The negatives vanish. His confidence erodes, silence follows. Consider Gary Wilcox in New York, 1964. A farmer in his field, meeting beings who ask about soil and crops. Later, the quiet visits of men in suits who remind him gently that his story is not his to share. He withdraws. Silence once again. Consider Robert Richardson in Ohio, 1973. A motorist collides with a craft, retrieves a fragment, speaks of it. Days later, the knock at the door, the calm warning, the fragment lost forever. The silence deepens. And consider Dan Sherman, inside the Air Force in the 1990s. A man trained to communicate with non-human intelligences, reminded constantly that curiosity is dangerous, that silence is the only loyalty. Even within the machine, the same rhythm. These are not isolated incidents, they are echoes. Each one fits into the same sequence, as though drawn from a script written long ago. And the echoes stretch beyond America's borders. In Canada, 1967, a prospector named Stephen Michalak encountered a landed craft near Falcon Lake. Drawn by curiosity, he touched its surface and was burned by a vent that seared his chest in a grid pattern. His injuries were real, documented by doctors. Yet the aftermath carried the same rhythm. Investigators arrived. Some said they were from the military, others gave no names. They questioned him endlessly, pressing for details, collecting samples, reminding him with their very presence that his story did not belong to him alone. At first Michalak spoke openly, but the constant questions, the visitors who seemed to know too much, wore him down. His son later said that the interrogations were harder to bear than the burns themselves. Slowly, Michalak fell silent. Across the ocean, in England, 1980, lights in Rendlesham Forest brought American airmen into the woods near RAF Woodbridge. Some described a craft glowing among the trees, its markings strange and deliberate. Others spoke of beams of light descending into the base itself. Colonel Halt's famous recording captured the astonishment in real time. But after the astonishment came the pressure. Servicemen reported, being reminded of their oaths, told their careers would suffer if they spoke. A few hinted at visits from men who seemed outside the chain of command, visitors whose presence was calm, official, and unsettling. The witnesses, like so many before them, grew cautious, their testimony, fragmented and hesitant, stretched out over decades but never flowed freely. Different countries, different decades, same silence. This global spread unsettled researchers. If the men in black were simply American agents, how could their presence be felt in Canada, Britain, Australia, and even the Soviet Union? If they were local officials, why did their behavior mirror so precisely the archetype? The suits, the calm words, the erosion of voices into quiet. It suggested something larger. Either multiple governments independently adopted the same methods of suppression, or the phenomenon itself carried its own custodians, its own gardeners of silence. As you listen now, picture this thread weaving outward. Bender at his desk in Connecticut, Villa with his photographs in New Mexico, Wilcox in his morning pasture, Richardson on the Ohio highway, Sherman at his Air Force console. Then picture Michalak at Falcon Lake, clutching his burned chest. Picture the airmen in Rendlesham Forest, their flashlights sweeping across glowing trees. Different places, different witnesses, same interruption, same hush. The men in black, whoever they may be, leave the same harvest everywhere, silence. The echoes do not stop with Bender, Villa, Wilcox, Richardson, Sherman, or even with Michalak at Falcon Lake and the airmen in Rendlesham Forest. The same rhythm, encounter, interruption, silence continues across oceans, unfolding in classrooms filled with children and in parks where families gathered on ordinary afternoons. It is here, in the voices of students in Australia and parents in the Soviet Union, that we see how wide the pattern truly spreads. In Melbourne, April 1966, the quiet suburb of Clayton South became the stage for one of the most astonishing mass sightings in history. At Westall High School, students were outside for recess when shouts filled the air. Dozens of hands pointed upward. Floating above them was a silver disc, smooth and gleaming in the midday sun. The craft tilted, hovered, and descended behind a row of trees into a nearby field. In seconds, children sprinted across the yard, some laughing, some shouting in awe. Teachers tried to restrain them, but curiosity pulled stronger than caution. In the clearing, witnesses later recalled, the craft rested briefly on the ground. Others said they only saw it rise again, tilting on its edge before darting into the sky at a speed beyond any aircraft. When the crowd reached the spot, the grass was flattened in a wide circle, as if pressed by weight and scorched by heat. The smell of something acrid lingered in the air. Hundreds of children, a dozen teachers, the evidence in the field. It should have been unforgettable, and it was, but not for the reasons one might expect. Because within hours, the visitors arrived. Some wore uniforms, others wore plain suits. They gathered the teachers, questioned them behind closed doors, and warned them about the dangers of spreading stories. They separated students, pressing them with calm but heavy questions. Some children were told they might face punishment if they spoke to reporters. Others were warned their futures would suffer. In the days that followed, early newspaper reports appeared, then abruptly stopped. Teachers refused interviews. Students who had been eager to describe what they saw grew quiet. The silence pressed down, not natural, but cultivated. Years later, as adults, many former students remembered the silver disc clearly, but even more vividly, they remembered the warnings. One described it as the day curiosity became fear. Another said the silence followed us out of childhood, like a shadow we could never escape. The men in black did not need to visit every home. Their presence at the school was enough. The silence spread, from the teachers to the students, from the students to their families, from the families to the community. Half a world away, in Voronezh, Soviet Union, 1989, another extraordinary event unfolded. It was a crisp autumn afternoon. Children played soccer in a city park, while parents strolled nearby. Suddenly, strange lights appeared overhead. A glowing craft descended slowly, its form metallic and structured, its surface shining with unnatural light. And then, the beings emerged. Witnesses described them as tall, with elongated limbs and large, dark eyes. Their movements were deliberate, uncanny. The soccer game stopped. The ball rolled silently into the grass. Children froze. Parents stared in disbelief. For several minutes, the scene held, the extraordinary unfolding in the heart of an ordinary park. Then the craft lifted, the beings vanished, and silence returned to the field. Soviet newspapers, enjoying the brief freedoms of glasnost, published the story widely. Western journalists picked it up, half in fascination, half in ridicule. For a moment it seemed the truth might spread openly, but soon came the pressure. Officials arrived, questioning witnesses, warning parents not to encourage children's fantasies. Teachers were instructed to discourage discussion in classrooms. Families reported visits from stern men who asked calm questions and reminded them of the consequences of speaking too freely. The children, who had shouted excitedly about the beings they had seen, grew hesitant. Parents, concerned for their livelihoods, urged silence. Within weeks, the story that had captured headlines faded back into obscurity. When researchers later traveled to Voronezh, they found witnesses cautious, their voices lowered, their words clipped. The silence, pressed into them by officials and strangers alike, had outlived the event itself. Australia and the Soviet Union could not have been more different in their politics, cultures, or languages. Yet in both places, the same rhythm unfolded: awe at the extraordinary. Visitors in suits or uniforms, warnings given, spoken or implied, silence that followed, stretching across years. For researchers, this consistency was the most haunting part. If the men in black were merely American agents, how could the same archetype appear in Melbourne and Voronezh? If they were local officials, why did their behavior mirror so precisely the same calm authority, the same insistence on quiet, the same erosion of voices? The explanation mattered little to the witnesses themselves. For them, the result was the same. In Melbourne, children grew into adults who still remembered the hush pressed upon them in their youth. In Voronezh, families carried unease long after the park returned to its ordinary quiet. Different continents, same silence. As you listen now, picture these two scenes. A schoolyard in Melbourne, children pointing skyward, laughter and awe turning to hush as strangers arrive. A park in Voronezh, a soccer ball still in the grass, parents holding their children close, officials reminding them to forget. These are not isolated stories, they are echoes, and together they whisper the same message: silence knows no borders. When we trace the echoes from Bender's quiet withdrawal in Connecticut, to Richardson's lost fragment in Ohio, to Sherman's uneasy silence inside the Air Force, to Michalak at Falcon Lake, to the airmen in Rendlesham, to the school children at Westall, to the families in Voronezh, the pattern becomes undeniable. The names change, the landscapes shift, the decades roll on, but the rhythm is the same. Awe at the extraordinary, interruption by the visitors, and the silence that follows. This silence is not simple absence, it is cultivated. It is presence wearing the mask of emptiness. The psychological toll for the witnesses, intimidation, did not end when the visitors left. It lived on inside them. Many described lying awake at night, replaying the calm but heavy words, imagining footsteps on the gravel outside, or headlights pausing too long at the edge of their street. Even when the visitors never returned, the impression of their presence lingered. Some withdrew from ordinary joys. Farmers grew quiet in diners. Teachers hesitated in classrooms. Photographers put away their cameras. Witnesses who once felt wonder when looking at the stars now felt unease. The sky itself seemed altered, not a canvas of beauty, but a reminder of what should not be spoken. Dreams carried the weight too. Some saw pale men standing at the foot of their beds. Others woke with the echo of knocks at the door. Even decades later, witnesses could recall the visitor's presence more vividly than the UFO itself. The silence became self-sustaining. Even without new visits, witnesses enforced it upon themselves, guarding their own words, doubting their own memories, fearing their own curiosity. The burden on families and communities. The toll did not stop at individuals. Families carried the silence as well. Spouses felt the weight of living with partners who seemed distracted, haunted, or afraid. Children overheard hushed conversations, saw glances exchanged across dinner tables, and absorbed the lesson without it ever being taught. Some things are seen but not spoken. Communities, too, learned the lesson secondhand. When one household fell quiet after a sighting, neighbors noticed, gossip dwindled, curiosity turned to ridicule. UFOs became jokes in small-town diners and whispered rumors at grocery stores. By the 1970s and 1980s, the subject had become taboo, fascinating in films, yes, but embarrassing in conversation. The men in black did not need to knock on every door. Their presence in a few homes was enough to ripple outward, seeding a culture of silence that grew on its own. Theories of purpose. Why this silence? What purpose does it serve? Researchers have long debated this question. Some argue that intimidation protects national security. If UFOs represent advanced technology, whether ours or someone else's, governments may silence witnesses to keep secrets from adversaries, or to avoid public panic. In this view, the men in black are simply operatives, their suits a uniform of control, their warnings practical measures to contain dangerous knowledge. Others suggest it is about narrative control. By ridiculing UFOs, silencing witnesses, and cultivating doubt, the phenomenon is kept at the margins. It remains folklore, never fact. The men in black in this theory are gardeners of perception, ensuring that no story grows large enough to change the cultural narrative. Still others argue that the men in black are non-human custodians. They are not agents of governments at all, but manifestations of the phenomenon itself. They appear wherever humanity glimpses too much, wearing the guise of authority, enforcing silence not for nations but for the phenomenon itself. Their role is not suppression, but pacing, ensuring humanity does not learn more than it is ready for. And then there are the psychological interpretations. Perhaps the men in black are archetypes, forms born in the human mind when faced with something incomprehensible. They are projections of fear and authority, symbolic figures that emerge when awe and terror collide. In this view, silence is not imposed from without, but from within. Our minds conjuring the shape of suppression as a way to cope. No single theory answers every question. If the men in black are only human, why the pale faces, the mechanical tones, the vanishing cars? If they are non-human, why rely on mundane methods like knocking on doors and asking questions? If they are archetypes, why do so many witnesses describe the same odd details? Perhaps the truth lies in a mixture, part human, part other, part psychological, layers of control, overlapping and interwoven, all serving the same outcome: silence. The harvest of silence. Imagine the world as a map across decades. Sparks of light appear, a disk in a pasture, a craft in a forest, a landing in a schoolyard, a glowing ship in a Soviet park. Each spark is a moment of illumination, but before the sparks can join together, blankets of silence are laid over them. The lights remain isolated, never forming a full picture. This may be the greatest purpose of intimidation, to fragment the truth. Each witness holds a piece of the puzzle, but silence ensures the pieces never connect. And yet, paradoxically, the silence itself becomes evidence. The very consistency of the hush, across borders and decades, suggests design. It whispers that there is something worth silencing. It invites curiosity, even as it enforces doubt. Closing the circle, as you rest with these reflections, imagine again the lives touched by silence. The farmer staring at his field, uneasy. The motorist glancing into his rearview mirror decades later. The child at Westall told never to repeat what she saw. The family in Voronezh reminded to dismiss their children's words as imagination. Different lives, same legacy. The men in black, whoever they may be, are not remembered for what they revealed, but for what they erased. Their true identity, human, non-human, or archetype, may never be known, but their purpose is clear. They cultivate silence, and in that silence, the mystery endures. As our journey through the shadows of the men in black draws to a close, we return to the silence they leave behind. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of intention, a quiet, pressed gently but firmly upon witnesses, families, communities, even entire cultures. It is this silence, heavy and deliberate, that has carried the mystery across decades and continents. Think back to the lives we have visited tonight. Albert Bender, withdrawing from his research circle after strangers arrived unbidden. Paul Villa, his photographs and confidence taken together. Gary Wilcox, the farmer who spoke of soil to beings from the sky before falling quiet under pressure. Robert Richardson, the motorist whose fragment vanished, whose safety was tied to silence. Dan Sherman, the insider reminded that loyalty meant never asking why. And beyond America's borders, the echoes continued. Stephen Michalak at Falcon Lake, his body burned, his voice worn down by questions. The airmen of Rendlesham Forest, warned of their oaths after seeing lights among the trees. The children of Westall, silenced before they could even grow into their voices. The families of Voronezh, told not to encourage their children's fantasies. Different names, different landscapes, the same harvest, silence. The men in black are not remembered for what they revealed, but for what they erased. Their legacy is not answers but absence. Not truth spoken, but truth hushed, and yet, paradoxically, this very absence is what keeps the mystery alive. Each silence whispers that something worth hiding lies beneath. Each withdrawn voice suggests that the extraordinary is real enough to threaten, powerful enough to suppress. The hush itself becomes a kind of testimony, telling us that even when evidence is gone, the weight of what was seen remains. Silence is not empty, it is full of memory, of pressure, of presence. It carries the weight of farmers, motorists, children, airmen, and insiders who all learned the same lesson. Some things are not to be spoken. As you rest now, let this understanding drift softly through your thoughts. The men in black may be government operatives, enforcing secrecy for national security. They may be non-human custodians, ensuring humanity sees only what it is ready for. They may be archetypes, projections of the mind, faced with the incomprehensible. Or they may be all of these, layered together, shadows wearing many masks, but their identity matters less than their effect. What endures is the hush they leave behind, a hush that stretches across lives and cultures, shaping how we think, how we speak, how we dream. Imagine the world as we traced it tonight, a Connecticut researcher at his desk, a New Mexico photographer with his camera, a farmer in his field, a motorist on a dark Ohio road, an Air Force technician at his console, a prospector on a Canadian lakeshore, soldiers in an English forest, children in an Australian schoolyard, families in a Soviet park, different moments, different people, all bound together by the same thread of silence. It is this thread that forms the tapestry of the men in black, not photographs, not fragments, not recordings, but silence. And now, let that silence become not burden, but comfort. The men in black may have pressed it into witnesses as warning, but here, for you, it becomes a lullaby. A gentle hush that smooths the edges of thought, slows the pace of memory, softens the weight of the day. As you close your eyes, imagine the silence settling softly around you like a blanket of night. The questions, the debates, the mysteries, all drift away, dissolving into quiet. What remains is only calm, only rest, only the steady rhythm of your own breath. The men in black may cultivate silence as control, but tonight, silence serves you differently. Tonight, it is sanctuary. It is the space where thought can loosen, where curiosity can soften, where sleep can rise gently like a tide. So let the hush carry you now. Let the world of witnesses and whispers fade into distance, like stars dissolving into dawn. Let the footsteps at the door fade, the questions fade, the worries fade. Let only calm remain. Rest in the silence that has traveled across decades. Rest in the mystery that endures not in answers but in quiet. Rest in the presence of the hush itself, steady and endless, for silence is not absence. Silence is presence, and in this presence, you are safe, you are calm, you are drifting. The men in black have always left silence behind. Tonight, that silence is not theirs, it is yours. Yours to sink into, yours to rest within, yours to carry you softly into sleep. So let go now, let the silence hum softly around you. Let it become not a warning, but a lullaby. Let it guide you gently into dreams.